Before we begin, tell us where you're watching us from. We'd love to read your comments and connect with viewers from around the world. The morning of September 15, 2001, Elizabeth and Bella Martinez were preparing for what would become the most infamous hiking trip in the history of the Ouachita National Forest. Elizabeth, 25, a graduate student studying environmental science at the University of Arkansas, was carefully packing her digital camera and research notebooks into her worn backpack. Her younger sister Bella, 22, a recent college dropout working at a Little Rock coffee shop, stood by their rented Jeep Cherokee, double-checking their camping supplies. The sisters had grown up in suburban Dallas, but had always been drawn to the wilderness. Their father, a park ranger, had taught them to read trail markers and survive in the woods from a young age. This trip to Arkansas was meant to be both a bonding experience and research opportunity for Elizabeth's thesis on forest ecosystem changes. The Ouachita National Forest stretches across western Arkansas and southeastern Oklahoma, covering nearly 2 million acres of dense pine and hardwood forests. Unlike the more popular Ozark Mountains to the north, the Ouachita region remained relatively unknown to casual hikers, making it perfect for Elizabeth's research on undisturbed wildlife patterns. At dawn, the sisters loaded their Cherokee with camping gear, 2 lightweight tents, sleeping bags rated for cool weather, a week's worth of dried food, a portable camp stove, and Elizabeth's expensive research equipment, including GPS units and wildlife cameras. They had permits for backcountry camping in the remote Caney Creek Wilderness area, where Elizabeth planned to document migration patterns of local deer populations. The last confirmed sighting of the Martinez sisters came at a mobile gas station in the small town of Mena, Arkansas, around noon that Saturday. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, remembered them distinctly because they purchased an unusual amount of extra batteries and asked detailed questions about accessing the old logging roads that led deeper into the wilderness areas. Elizabeth paid with her student credit card and bought 2 large bottles of water, while Bella grabbed snacks and a road atlas of Arkansas. Mrs. Hayes later told investigators that both young women seemed excited and well prepared, discussing their planned route to a remote research area near the Cossato River tributaries. From Mena, it was another hour's drive on increasingly narrow mountain roads to reach their intended camping area. The final 15 miles followed an abandoned logging road where cell phone towers couldn't reach and GPS signals became unreliable due to the thick forest canopy overhead. Elizabeth's last contact with civilization was a brief satellite phone call to her academic advisor at 3:45 p.m., confirming they had reached the trailhead and would begin setting up their research camp before sunset. The call cut out mid-sentence, which wasn't unusual given the challenging terrain and limited satellite coverage in that remote corner of Arkansas. But what really happened to Elizabeth and Bella Martinez in those dark Arkansas woods would remain a mystery for nearly 8 long years, until one survivor emerged from the forest with a story so disturbing that investigators initially refused to believe it could be true. When Elizabeth failed to check in with her academic advisor by Monday evening as planned, Dr. Robert Chen initially wasn't concerned. Graduate students researching in remote areas often encountered delays due to equipment problems or interesting discoveries that extended their field time. But by Wednesday morning, when both sisters missed their scheduled return to Little Rock, alarm bells began ringing. Bella's manager at the Riverside Coffee Company called their parents in Dallas after she failed to show up for her Thursday shift without explanation. The Martinez sisters had never been irresponsible about work commitments. Their father, Miguel Martinez, a veteran park ranger with 30 years of experience in Texas state parks, immediately knew something was seriously wrong. Within hours, Miguel was driving north toward Arkansas in his pickup truck, while their mother, Carmen, contacted the Polk County Sheriff's Office to report her daughters missing. The initial response was frustratingly familiar to families of missing hikers. Authorities suggested waiting another day or two, as experienced outdoors enthusiasts often stayed longer than planned when weather conditions were favorable. But Miguel Martinez understood wilderness dangers better than most. Thursday afternoon, he arrived at the Caney Creek Wilderness Trailhead, where his daughters had planned to conduct their research. The Cherokee was exactly where the gas station clerk had described, parked at the end of Forest Road 38, about 2 miles from the wilderness boundary. The vehicle sat undisturbed on the narrow gravel road, its doors locked and windows rolled up tight. Through the glass, Miguel could see Elizabeth's expensive camera equipment still secured in hard cases on the back seat. Her research notebooks lay scattered across the dashboard, and both sisters' purses remained in the front seat with their wallets, credit cards, and identification intact. Most troubling of all, their cell phones were plugged into the Cherokee's charging ports, batteries completely drained. The last outgoing calls showed Elizabeth had tried repeatedly to reach cell towers between Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning, suggesting they had returned to the vehicle at some point, but been unable to establish contact with the outside world. Sheriff's deputies found clear evidence that the sisters had made at least 2 trips between their vehicle and a campsite approximately half a mile into the wilderness along Caney Creek. Boot prints matching their hiking shoes led along the established trail, and broken branches indicated they had carried heavy equipment through the dense understory. The campsite discovery came on Friday afternoon, when search volunteers located a cleared area near the creek where Elizabeth had obviously set up her research station. Her expensive GPS units and wildlife cameras were arranged methodically around a large oak tree, still functioning and recording data. A ring of stones marked where they had built a careful campfire, now cold and scattered. What disturbed the searchers most was the campsite's condition. Unlike the panicked abandonment that usually marked hiking accidents or bear encounters, everything appeared deliberately organized. Their tents had been properly collapsed and folded, sleeping bags rolled tightly and stacked neatly beside a tree. Cooking supplies were cleaned and packed away in bear-proof containers. Yet Elizabeth's research indicated she had planned to spend at least 5 days in the area collecting data. Her equipment was programmed to run continuous monitoring cycles through the following Wednesday. The sisters had brought enough food and supplies for a week-long stay, but they had apparently packed up and left after just 1 or 2 nights. The only signs of disturbance were several deep gouges in the dirt around their campfire, as if heavy objects had been dragged across the ground. Boot prints from at least 3 different people were visible in the soft creek bank, but the patterns were too confused to provide clear direction or distance traveled. As search teams expanded their efforts into the rugged terrain surrounding Caney Creek, one disturbing question echoed through the Arkansas wilderness. If Elizabeth and Bella had packed up their campsite so carefully, why had they left behind their vehicle, their identification, and thousands of dollars worth of research equipment that represented Elizabeth's entire graduate career? The massive search operation for Elizabeth and Bella Martinez officially began on Saturday morning, September 22nd, 1 week after their disappearance. Arkansas State Police coordinated with the Forest Service to deploy over 60 volunteers, including experienced trackers from local hunting clubs, members of the Arkansas Search and Rescue Association, and a specialized K-9 unit from Little Rock. The search grid covered nearly 40 square miles of the most rugged terrain in the Caney Creek wilderness. Teams worked methodically through dense stands of shortleaf pine and oak, following every deer path and creek bed that might have attracted the sisters during their research expedition. The terrain was treacherous, steep ridges cut by deep hollows where century-old logging operations had left behind unstable slopes and hidden ravines. On the 3rd day of searching, the bloodhounds finally picked up a scent trail leading away from Elizabeth's research campsite. The dogs followed the trail for nearly 2 miles through increasingly difficult terrain, eventually losing it at a rocky outcrop where scents couldn't penetrate the stone surfaces. The direction troubled experienced searchers. It led deeper into the wilderness, away from any established trails or roads. More disturbing discoveries emerged as search teams pushed further into the remote areas. Tuesday afternoon, volunteers found evidence of another campsite, approximately 4 miles from where the Martinez sisters had been conducting their research. Unlike Elizabeth's methodically organized research station, this site showed signs of long-term occupation by people who clearly weren't casual hikers. The mysterious camp contained several crude lean-to shelters built from fallen timber and camouflaged with branches and leaves. Blackened fire rings suggested the site had been used repeatedly over months or possibly years. Most unsettling were the dozens of animal bones scattered around the camp, not the clean remains of normal hunting, but bones that had been cracked and split as if someone had been extracting every bit of nutrition possible. Forest Service rangers examined the site and determined it hadn't been used by any authorized research groups or permitted camping parties. The construction methods were primitive but effective, suggesting whoever had built these shelters possessed significant wilderness survival skills. Carved notches in nearby trees appeared to mark territories or boundaries, though their meaning remained unclear. 50 yards from the main camp, searchers discovered something that made even experienced law enforcement officers uncomfortable. A circular clearing had been deliberately created by cutting down small trees and clearing all undergrowth. Large stones had been arranged in a precise pattern around the perimeter, and the center area showed evidence of repeated fires that had burned hot enough to turn the soil black. The most chilling find came when investigators used metal detectors to search the mysterious clearing. Buried 6 inches beneath the scorched earth, they uncovered several personal items that clearly didn't belong to wilderness campers: a child's plastic bracelet, corroded metal buttons from clothing, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be human teeth wrapped in a decaying piece of fabric. Sheriff's deputies immediately cordoned off the area and called in forensic specialists from the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory. Initial examination suggested the items had been buried for several years, ruling out any direct connection to the missing Martinez sisters. However, the discovery raised terrifying new questions about who might be living in the depths of the Ouachita wilderness. As search teams expanded their operations, local residents began coming forward with stories they had previously dismissed as imagination or exaggeration. Hunters reported glimpsing smoke from campfires in areas where no camping was permitted. Hikers described finding strange symbols carved into trees and the unsettling sensation of being watched from the forest depths. Most significantly, a Forest Service road maintenance crew remembered encountering a group of oddly dressed individuals during the summer of 2000. The workers had been clearing fallen trees from a remote access road when they noticed several people watching them from the tree line. When the crew waved and called out friendly greetings, the watchers had simply melted back into the forest without responding. By the end of the second week, search coordinators faced a grim reality. Elizabeth and Bella Martinez had vanished without a trace into a wilderness that apparently harbored secrets far darker than anyone had imagined. The question was no longer simply where the sisters had gone, but whether they had encountered something in those Arkansas woods that no amount of outdoor experience could have prepared them to survive. 3 weeks into the search for Elizabeth and Bella Martinez, Arkansas authorities faced a harsh reality that families of missing persons know all too well. Despite deploying every available resource, including thermal imaging helicopters borrowed from the Drug Enforcement Administration and specialized cave rescue teams from Tennessee, the sisters had seemingly vanished without leaving a single definitive clue about their fate. The weather became the search operation's greatest enemy. October brought unseasonably heavy rains to the Ouachita Mountains, turning creek beds into torrents and making the already treacherous terrain nearly impassable for search teams. Flooding washed away any remaining scent trails that the bloodhounds might have followed, and the constant downpours made helicopter operations impossible for days at a time. Sheriff Tom Bradley of Polk County made the difficult decision to scale back active search operations on October 15th, exactly 1 month after the Martinez sisters had last been seen alive. Basic patrols would continue, and the case would remain officially active. But the massive coordinated effort involving dozens of volunteers and multiple agencies had to be suspended due to safety concerns and dwindling leads. The decision devastated Miguel and Carmen Martinez, who had spent every day since their daughter's disappearance camped in a Mena motel, coordinating with search teams and hiking through the wilderness themselves. Miguel, whose 30 years as a Texas park ranger had taught him to read landscapes like books, couldn't accept that his daughters had simply gotten lost in terrain that should have been manageable for experienced hikers. Against official recommendations, Miguel continued his own search efforts throughout the winter months. He studied topographical maps until he could navigate the Caney Creek wilderness blindfolded, learning every ridge, hollow, and creek crossing within a 20-mile radius of where Elizabeth and Bella had last been seen. His obsession with finding answers began to consume him entirely. During these solitary searches, Miguel discovered additional evidence that the mysterious forest dwellers were more than just survivalist campers. Hidden caches of supplies were buried beneath carefully camouflaged markers, not the random gear of weekend warriors, but systematic stockpiles that suggested long-term planning and organization. Most disturbing were the carved symbols he found on trees throughout the area, crude markings that seemed to form a communication system between different camp locations. The forensic analysis of items found at the ceremonial clearing provided more questions than answers. The human teeth proved to be from at least 3 different individuals, and carbon dating suggested they had been buried over a period of several years. DNA testing was inconclusive due to degradation, but the discovery prompted Arkansas State Police to open a broader investigation into possible serial crimes in the region. Local newspapers picked up the story, and soon the Martinez case attracted attention from true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators across the country. Online forums buzzed with theories ranging from cult activity to human trafficking operations hidden in the vast Arkansas wilderness. While most speculation was unhelpful, some amateur researchers uncovered disturbing patterns in missing person reports from across the region. A careful analysis of disappearances in Arkansas, eastern Oklahoma, and northern Louisiana over the previous decade revealed a troubling trend. At least 8 individuals had vanished while hiking, hunting, or camping in remote forest areas, with their abandoned vehicles and campsites discovered in conditions similar to what searchers had found at the Martinez sisters' research station. Most cases had been classified as accidental deaths or voluntary disappearances. The revelation that Elizabeth and Bella might be victims of a larger pattern of predatory behavior in the region's wilderness areas prompted federal involvement. FBI agents specializing in serial crimes began reviewing cold cases and coordinating with local authorities to develop a more comprehensive investigative approach. But for the Martinez family, statistical analysis and federal investigations provided little comfort. As winter snow began falling in the Ouachita Mountains, the chances of finding Elizabeth and Bella alive diminished with each passing day. The wilderness that had once represented adventure and discovery for the sisters had become a symbol of unimaginable loss for everyone who loved them. Yet deep in those same Arkansas woods, in places where even experienced searchers feared to venture, a far more terrible story was just beginning to unfold. One that would remain hidden for nearly 8 more years until a single survivor emerged from the darkness with testimony so shocking that investigators would initially refuse to believe it could possibly be true. The Martinez sisters' disappearance gradually faded from newspaper headlines as 2002 arrived, joining the growing list of unsolved missing person cases that haunt America's vast wilderness areas. Miguel Martinez never stopped searching, but his increasingly desperate solo expeditions into the Ouachita Mountains began taking a severe toll on his physical and mental health. Carmen Martinez threw herself into advocacy work, connecting with other families of missing hikers and lobbying for improved search and rescue protocols in national forests. She established the Martinez Family Foundation, which provided funding for extended search operations and better communication equipment for wilderness emergency responders. By 2003, the official investigation had been scaled back to periodic reviews of cold case files. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile suggesting that Elizabeth and Bella had likely encountered an organized group of individuals living off-grid in the forest, but without concrete evidence or additional disappearances. Following the same pattern, federal resources were redirected to more active cases. The mysterious forest camps discovered during the initial search were monitored sporadically by Arkansas State Police, but they appeared to have been permanently abandoned. Rain and wildlife had gradually reclaimed the crude shelters, and the carved symbols on nearby trees had been obscured by new bark growth. Whatever presence had once occupied those remote areas seemed to have vanished as completely as the Martinez sisters themselves. Local communities in the Ouachita region developed their own theories and folklore around the disappearance. Some hunters claimed to have glimpsed smoke from illegal campfires in the deepest wilderness areas, while others reported finding fresh tool marks on trees and evidence of recent human activity miles from any established trails. These reports were investigated when resources permitted, but searchers never found anything more substantial than old campsites and abandoned equipment. The case took an unexpected turn in 2005 when construction workers building a new logging road discovered human remains buried in a shallow grave approximately 15 miles from the Martinez sisters' last known campsite. Initial hopes that the discovery might finally provide answers were crushed when forensic analysis determined the bones belonged to a middle-aged man who had died at least a decade earlier, long before Elizabeth and Bella had entered the forest. However, the discovery prompted a more systematic archaeological survey of the region, which uncovered evidence that the Ouachita wilderness had been harboring transient populations for much longer than anyone had realized. Native American artifacts suggested the area had been used as seasonal hunting grounds for centuries, while more recent finds indicated that military deserters, escaped prisoners, and various survivalist groups had periodically established temporary communities in the forest's most inaccessible regions. Miguel Martinez's health began failing seriously in 2006, forcing him to reduce his personal search efforts. The years of hiking through dangerous terrain while carrying the emotional weight of his daughter's disappearance had aged him far beyond his years. Carmen feared she would lose her husband, as well as her daughters, to the Arkansas wilderness that had already claimed so much from their family. As the 5th anniversary of the disappearance approached in 2006, a documentary film crew contacted the Martinez family about producing a program on unsolved wilderness disappearances. While Carmen initially resisted the intrusion, she eventually agreed to participate, hoping that renewed media attention might generate new leads or encourage witnesses to come forward with information they had previously withheld. The documentary, titled Lost in the Ouachitas, aired on the Discovery Channel in early 2007 and generated significant viewer response. Hundreds of tips poured in from across the country, ranging from psychic visions to claims of sighting the sisters in various locations. Most leads proved worthless, but several callers provided intriguing details about suspicious activities they had observed in Arkansas forests during the early 2000s. One particularly compelling tip came from a retired Forest Service employee who remembered encountering a group of disheveled individuals near the Buffalo National River in 2003. The man described seeing what appeared to be captives being marched through the forest under armed guard, but he had dismissed the sighting as military training exercises or survivalist games. Only after watching the documentary did he realize the potential significance of what he had witnessed. By 2008, 7 years after Elizabeth and Bella Martinez had vanished into the Arkansas wilderness, their case had become a local legend and a cautionary tale told around campfires throughout the region. But in the deepest, most remote corners of the Ouachita National Forest, a far more terrifying story was still unfolding, one that would finally emerge into daylight when a single, broken survivor managed to escape from a nightmare that had lasted nearly a decade. On the morning of March 18, 2009, Deputy Sheriff Mike Crawford was working the overnight shift at the Johnson County Police Department in Clarksville, Arkansas, when the front doors opened and a figure stumbled inside that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The person who approached the front desk appeared to be a severely malnourished woman in her late 20s, with long, matted hair and clothes that looked like they had been fashioned from animal skins and scraps of fabric. Deputy Crawford's first instinct was that he was dealing with a homeless individual or someone suffering from severe mental illness. The woman's arms and face were covered in scars, some appearing fresh, while others had clearly healed over many years. She moved with the hesitant, fearful gestures of someone who had experienced prolonged trauma. When the woman spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and her words sent chills through the experienced officer. She said her name was Elizabeth Martinez, and she had been missing from the Ouachita National Forest for nearly 8 years. At first, Crawford assumed this was another false claim from someone seeking attention or suffering from delusions. However, when Elizabeth began recounting specific details about her disappearance that had never been released to the public, the exact location of her research campsite, the equipment she had been using, and personal information about her sister Bella, Crawford realized he might be dealing with something unprecedented. He immediately contacted Arkansas State Police and requested that a detective be dispatched to the station. Elizabeth's physical condition was shocking to medical personnel who examined her that afternoon. She weighed approximately 95 pounds and stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, meaning she had lost at least 50 pounds during her captivity. Her teeth showed signs of severe neglect and malnutrition, with several missing entirely. Most disturbing were the numerous scars covering her body, many of which appeared to be deliberate cuts made with crude instruments. Dr. Sarah Wilson, the emergency room physician who conducted the initial examination, noted that Elizabeth displayed classic symptoms of prolonged psychological trauma. She flinched at sudden movements, refused to make eye contact with male medical staff, and became extremely agitated when anyone attempted to touch her without warning. The doctor recommended that interrogation be postponed until Elizabeth had received proper nutrition and psychological evaluation. For the first 3 days after her emergence, Elizabeth remained largely silent, communicating only through nods and single-word responses. She consumed small amounts of food and water, but appeared terrified of being left alone, constantly scanning the room as if expecting an attack. Hospital staff noted that she slept in brief intervals and never seemed to enter deep sleep phases. The breakthrough came on the 4th day when Elizabeth finally agreed to speak with Detective Linda Hayes, a specialist in trauma cases who had been flown in from the Arkansas State Police headquarters in Little Rock. Detective Hayes spent hours gaining Elizabeth's trust before attempting to gather any information about what had happened during those 8 missing years. Elizabeth's account began with that September evening in 2001, when she and Bella had set up their research camp along Caney Creek. According to her testimony, they were awakened in the middle of their 2nd night by bright flashlight beams shining through their tent walls. Before they could react, several individuals in dark clothing had surrounded their campsite and ordered them to remain silent. The sisters were bound with rope and had cloth bags placed over their heads before being marched through the forest for what Elizabeth estimated to be several hours. The terrain was difficult, involving stream crossings and steep climbs that left both sisters exhausted and disoriented. Their captors spoke very little, communicating mostly through hand signals and harsh whispers. When the bags were finally removed, Elizabeth and Bella found themselves in what appeared to be an underground shelter dug into a hillside and reinforced with logs and stones. The space was approximately 12 feet square and 8 feet deep, with a wooden ladder providing the only means of entrance or exit. Most terrifying was the discovery that they were not the first victims. 2 other individuals were already imprisoned in the underground chamber. But Elizabeth's story was only beginning, and the details she would reveal about her 8 years in captivity would expose a network of violence and control that had operated undetected in the Arkansas wilderness for potentially decades, claiming victims who had simply vanished without a trace into the vast and unforgiving forest. Elizabeth's testimony to Detective Hayes revealed a nightmare that had unfolded in the deepest recesses of the Ouachita wilderness, far from any established trails or ranger stations. According to her account, the group that had captured her and Bella consisted of 6 individuals who had been living off-grid in the Arkansas forest for over a decade. The leader was a man in his 50s who called himself Ranger and demanded that all captives address him by that title. Elizabeth learned that his real name was Daniel Kruger, a former Army sergeant who had deserted during the Gulf War and had been living as a fugitive in various wilderness areas across the southeastern United States. He possessed extensive survival skills and had trained the other group members in military-style discipline and forest warfare techniques. The underground prison where Elizabeth and Bella were initially held was one of several such structures the group had constructed throughout their territory. The captives were rotated between different locations to prevent them from learning the overall layout of the area and to make escape more difficult. Each underground shelter was stocked with minimal supplies and was virtually impossible to detect from the surface. Elizabeth described the group's twisted philosophy as a combination of survivalist ideology and militant anti-government beliefs. They viewed themselves as the true inheritors of the American wilderness and considered anyone who entered their territory to be trespassers who deserved punishment. Captives were forced to participate in grueling physical labor, including constructing new shelters, gathering food, and maintaining the network of hidden camps. The daily routine was deliberately designed to break down the prisoners' resistance and sense of identity. Each morning began with forced marches through difficult terrain while carrying heavy packs of supplies. Captives who showed signs of weakness or rebellion were denied food and subjected to psychological torture, including being left alone in complete darkness for days at a time. Bella had struggled more than Elizabeth to adapt to the brutal conditions of captivity. Her younger sister had repeatedly attempted to resist their captors' demands and had tried to organize escape attempts with other prisoners. Elizabeth recounted how Bella had maintained hope that their father would find them, constantly planning and plotting ways to signal for help or break free from the underground prisons. The group moved their operation frequently, using an extensive network of animal trails and abandoned logging roads that allowed them to transport captives and supplies without detection. They had established supply caches throughout the forest and had developed sophisticated early warning systems using tripwires and homemade alarms to detect approaching searchers or law enforcement. After 18 months in captivity, Bella attempted her most serious escape effort. During a supply-gathering expedition, she managed to break away from her guards and ran toward what she believed was the direction of the main forest roads. She was recaptured within hours by tracking dogs that the group had trained specifically for hunting escaped prisoners. Elizabeth broke down completely when recounting what happened next. Ranger declared that Bella's repeated escape attempts made her too dangerous to keep alive, and that her execution would serve as an example to the other captives. The entire group participated in what they called a cleansing ceremony, where Bella was forced to kneel in the center of the ritual clearing, while each member threw stones at her until she died. Elizabeth watched helplessly as her sister was murdered, knowing that any attempt to intervene would result in her own death. Bella's body was buried in the marshy area that searchers had found during the initial investigation, but Elizabeth was forced to participate in digging the grave as additional psychological torture designed to ensure her complete submission. After Bella's death, Elizabeth realized that her only chance of survival was to completely surrender to the group's demands and wait for an opportunity to escape. She began participating in their daily routines without resistance, helping to maintain their camps and even assisting in the capture and control of new prisoners who were brought to the underground facilities. But Elizabeth's story was far from over, and the details she would reveal about the group's operations and their other victims would expose a criminal enterprise that had been systematically hunting and enslaving people in America's wilderness areas for years, leaving behind a trail of missing persons cases that investigators had never connected until now. Elizabeth's testimony continued over several days as Detective Hayes carefully documented the horrifying details of nearly 8 years spent as a prisoner in the Arkansas wilderness. The survivor's account revealed that Daniel Kruger's group had been systematically capturing hikers, hunters, and campers throughout the region since the mid-1990s, operating an elaborate network of hidden facilities that had remained completely undetected by law enforcement. During her captivity, Elizabeth encountered at least 12 other prisoners who had been brought to the various underground compounds over the years. Most were solo hikers or small groups who had ventured too deep into remote areas of the Ouachita wilderness. The captors specifically targeted individuals whose disappearances were unlikely to generate massive search efforts, people hiking alone, estranged family members, and those with minimal social connections. The group's operation was far more sophisticated than investigators had initially imagined. They maintained multiple prison sites, connected by hidden trails that could only be navigated by someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Supply caches were buried throughout their territory, and they had established lookout posts that provided early warning of approaching search teams or Forest Service personnel. Kruger ruled through systematic brutality, designed to crush any hope of escape or resistance. New captives underwent a breaking period that could last for months, during which they were subjected to starvation, isolation, physical abuse, and psychological torture. Those who survived this initial phase were gradually integrated into the group's forced labor system, maintaining camps, gathering food, and helping to capture new victims. Elizabeth described how the group moved their prisoners between different locations based on seasonal patterns and the level of law enforcement activity in the area. During hunting seasons or periods of increased ranger patrols, captives were relocated to the most remote sites, sometimes spending weeks in underground chambers with minimal food and no contact with daylight. The captors had developed their own twisted hierarchy and belief system that justified their actions. They viewed themselves as the rightful inhabitants of the wilderness and considered outsiders to be invaders who deserved punishment. Kruger preached that modern society was corrupt and that they were purifying their victims through suffering, preparing them for a more authentic existence in harmony with nature. Over the years, Elizabeth witnessed the deaths of at least 6 other prisoners. Some died from malnutrition and disease, while others were executed for attempted escapes or perceived acts of defiance. The group maintained a burial ground in a swampy area, approximately 3 miles from their main compound, where bodies were disposed of in shallow graves marked only by carved symbols on nearby trees. The psychological manipulation employed by Kruger and his followers was particularly sophisticated. They alternated periods of extreme brutality with moments of relative kindness, creating a dependency relationship that made prisoners reluctant to attempt escape even when opportunities arose. Captives who showed complete submission were occasionally allowed small privileges, such as better food or brief periods above ground. Elizabeth's survival strategy evolved over time as she learned to navigate the group's complex social dynamics. She discovered that showing enthusiasm for their philosophical beliefs and volunteering for dangerous tasks could earn her limited trust and access to areas of their territory that other prisoners never saw. This knowledge would eventually prove crucial to her escape. By 2007, Elizabeth had become one of the longest surviving captives in the group's history. Her apparent conversion to their ideology allowed her to participate in supply runs and the construction of new facilities. During these activities, she carefully memorized landmarks and trail systems, gradually building a mental map of the region that extended far beyond the immediate prison compounds. The opportunity for escape finally presented itself in February 2009, when Kruger decided to relocate their operation due to increased Forest Service activity in their traditional territory. During the chaos of moving prisoners and supplies through difficult winter terrain, Elizabeth managed to slip away from a work detail and disappear into the dense forest that had been her prison for nearly 8 years. But even as Elizabeth's testimony provided investigators with their first real leads in the case, the task of locating and apprehending Kruger's group would prove to be one of the most challenging manhunts in Arkansas law enforcement history, requiring a massive coordinated effort across multiple agencies and thousands of acres of unforgiving wilderness terrain. Within hours of Elizabeth Martinez confirming the details of her captivity, Arkansas State Police launched Operation Pine Ridge, the largest manhunt in the state's history. Over 200 law enforcement officers from multiple agencies converged on the Ouachita National Forest, including FBI hostage rescue specialists, Arkansas National Guard units, and tracking experts borrowed from Border Patrol operations in Texas. Elizabeth's detailed knowledge of the group's territory provided investigators with their first real leads in 8 years. She had memorized dozens of landmarks during her captivity: distinctive rock formations, creek crossings, and abandoned logging roads that formed a rough map of Kruger's domain. Using her descriptions, search teams identified a target area covering approximately 150 square miles of the most remote wilderness in western Arkansas. The first breakthrough came on March 25th, when helicopters equipped with thermal imaging detected multiple heat signatures in a valley that matched Elizabeth's description of the main compound. Ground teams approaching the location found elaborate defensive positions, camouflaged trenches, tripwires connected to warning devices, and booby traps designed to injure pursuing officers. The abandoned campsite revealed the sophistication of Kruger's operation. Investigators discovered multiple underground shelters connected by concealed tunnels, sophisticated water collection and filtration systems, and stockpiles of military surplus equipment. Most disturbing were the prison facilities, reinforced underground chambers with heavy wooden doors and evidence of prolonged human habitation under horrific conditions. Forensic teams working the site uncovered physical evidence that corroborated Elizabeth's testimony. DNA samples from hair and clothing fragments found in the prison chambers matched genetic material from several missing person cases dating back over a decade. The discovery proved that Kruger's group had been systematically capturing and holding victims far longer than anyone had imagined. The search for Bella Martinez's remains led investigators to the marshy burial ground that Elizabeth had described. Using ground-penetrating radar and specialized excavation techniques, forensic anthropologists located human remains buried at various depths throughout the area. The first remains recovered were positively identified as Bella Martinez through dental records, finally giving the family confirmation of her fate after 8 years of uncertainty. However, the manhunt for the living members of Kruger's group proved far more challenging. The captors had clearly abandoned their main compound weeks before Elizabeth's escape, leaving behind only the most basic supplies and equipment. Tracking dogs followed scent trails for miles through difficult terrain, but the group had used sophisticated counter-tracking techniques to mask their movement. The breakthrough in locating the fugitives came from an unexpected source. A convenience store clerk in the small town of Waldron, Arkansas, remembered selling an unusual amount of medical supplies and canned food to a group of disheveled individuals who paid entirely in small bills and seemed nervous around other customers. Security camera footage confirmed that 3 of the purchasers matched descriptions Elizabeth had provided of Kruger's lieutenants. State police established a perimeter around Waldron and began systematically searching abandoned buildings, hunting cabins, and remote properties where the group might have taken refuge. Local residents were advised to report any suspicious activity and to avoid isolated areas where armed fugitives might be hiding. The first arrest came on April 2nd, when officers surrounded an abandoned farmhouse 15 miles south of Waldron. Inside, they found 2 members of Kruger's group, Sarah Mitchell, 34, and Robert Hayes, 29, along with evidence linking them to multiple kidnappings and murders. Both individuals had been living with the group for over 6 years and possessed detailed knowledge of their operations and victim disposal methods. Under interrogation, Mitchell revealed that Kruger had split his remaining followers into smaller groups after Elizabeth's escape, with orders to re-establish operations in different wilderness areas across Oklahoma and Louisiana. She provided investigators with the locations of additional burial sites and supply caches, information that would prove crucial in building cases against the surviving members of the organization. But the most dangerous fugitive remained at large somewhere in the vast wilderness of the American South. Daniel Kruger, the mastermind behind nearly 2 decades of systematic kidnapping and murder, had vanished into terrain he knew better than anyone, carrying with him the knowledge and skills to continue his reign of terror in a new location where no one would think to look for him. The hunt for Daniel Kruger intensified throughout the spring of 2009 as federal marshals expanded their search beyond Arkansas into surrounding states. Intelligence gathered from the captured group members revealed that Kruger had established fallback positions in remote areas of eastern Oklahoma and northern Louisiana, creating a network of safe houses and supply caches that stretched across hundreds of miles of wilderness. FBI behavioral analysts developed a comprehensive profile of Kruger based on Elizabeth's testimony and evidence recovered from the abandoned camps. The former Army sergeant possessed advanced survival skills, intimate knowledge of federal search protocols, and a paranoid mindset that made him extremely dangerous when cornered. His military background suggested he would choose defensible positions and might attempt to take hostages if escape routes were blocked. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source in late April. A wildlife photographer working in the Ouachita National Forest of Louisiana reported finding recent human tracks and signs of temporary shelters in an area that had been closed to public access for years. Forest Service rangers investigating the report discovered evidence of recent occupation: cold fire rings, improvised tool marks on trees, and most significantly, carved symbols that matched those found at Kruger's Arkansas compound. Surveillance teams equipped with motion-activated cameras and acoustic monitoring equipment were deployed throughout the suspected area. Within days, they had documented movement patterns that suggested at least 3 individuals were living in the forest and following regular patrol routes between different camp locations. The behavioral patterns matched Kruger's known operating procedures exactly. On May 8, 2009, thermal imaging from a surveillance aircraft detected multiple heat signatures moving through a valley deep within the Ouachita wilderness. Ground teams moving to intercept the fugitives discovered an elaborate defensive position that Kruger had been constructing for weeks. The site included camouflaged observation posts, escape tunnels, and booby traps designed to delay pursuing officers. The final confrontation occurred at dawn on May 10th, when a combined team of FBI hostage rescue specialists and Louisiana State Police SWAT officers surrounded Kruger's position. The fugitive leader had barricaded himself inside a reinforced bunker, constructed from fallen logs and steel plates, armed with several high-powered rifles and enough supplies to sustain a lengthy siege. Negotiators attempted to establish communication with Kruger for over 6 hours, but the former sergeant refused to respond to surrender demands. Elizabeth Martinez, who had been working closely with investigators throughout the manhunt, provided crucial intelligence about Kruger's psychological state and likely responses to different tactical approaches. Her insights proved invaluable in predicting his behavior patterns. The siege ended abruptly when Kruger attempted to escape through one of his concealed tunnels, apparently believing that darkness would provide cover for his movement. However, night vision equipment and thermal sensors allowed tactical teams to track his exact location, and he was apprehended without shots being fired approximately 200 yards from his bunker. Daniel Kruger's capture marked the end of one of the most extensive wilderness manhunts in American law enforcement history. The 52-year-old former soldier showed no remorse when arrested, maintaining that he had been defending his territory against invaders and that his actions were justified under natural law. His cold demeanor and complete lack of empathy for his victims shocked even experienced investigators. The final 2 members of Kruger's group, James Morrison, 38, and Linda Curtis, 31, were apprehended at a remote cabin in eastern Oklahoma 3 days later. Both individuals surrendered without resistance and provided additional details about the group's operations, including the locations of burial sites and evidence caches that investigators had not yet discovered. With all known members of the criminal organization now in custody, forensic teams began the grim task of excavating additional burial sites and attempting to identify victims whose disappearances had never been connected to Kruger's activities. The scope of the group's crimes continued to expand as investigators uncovered evidence linking them to missing person cases dating back to the early 1990s. But even as justice began to take its course through the legal system, the true extent of the psychological damage inflicted by Kruger and his followers was only beginning to emerge, as Elizabeth Martinez and other survivors faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by years of unimaginable trauma. The trial of Daniel Kruger and his followers began on November 15, 2010, in the Federal District Court in Little Rock, Arkansas. The case had attracted national media attention, making it one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in the state's history. Kruger faced charges including multiple counts of kidnapping, murder, conspiracy, and violations of federal civil rights laws. Elizabeth Martinez proved to be a compelling and credible witness during her testimony, which lasted for 4 days. Despite the obvious psychological trauma she had endured, she provided detailed, consistent accounts of her captivity and the systematic brutality inflicted by Kruger's group. Her ability to identify specific locations, describe the group's operational methods, and recall conversations from years earlier impressed both prosecutors and defense attorneys. The physical evidence presented during the trial painted a horrifying picture of the scope of Kruger's crimes. Forensic anthropologists had recovered the remains of 14 victims from various burial sites throughout the Arkansas wilderness. DNA analysis had positively identified 8 of the victims, including Bella Martinez, linking them to missing person cases spanning nearly 2 decades. Dr. Patricia Stevens, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Elizabeth, testified about the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques used by the group. She explained how Kruger had employed a combination of physical torture, social isolation, and intermittent reinforcement to break down his victims' resistance and create psychological dependency that made escape attempts extremely difficult. The defense attempted to portray Kruger as a mentally ill individual suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder related to his military service. However, psychiatric evaluations conducted by court-appointed experts determined that while Kruger showed signs of personality disorders and paranoid thinking, he clearly understood the nature of his actions and was capable of distinguishing right from wrong. Sarah Mitchell and Robert Hayes, two of Kruger's captured followers, agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for reduced sentences. Their testimony provided crucial details about the group's organizational structure, recruitment methods, and the systematic nature of their criminal activities. Mitchell revealed that Kruger had maintained detailed records of his victims, including personal information gathered during their captivity. The most damaging evidence against Kruger came from his own writings, discovered during the search of his various camps. Investigators found journals spanning over 15 years, in which he detailed his philosophical justifications for kidnapping and murdering innocent people. The writings revealed a deeply disturbed individual who genuinely believed he was purifying society by eliminating those he considered weak or corrupt. On February 3, 2011, after deliberating for less than 6 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts against Daniel Kruger. The same jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, citing the extraordinary cruelty and premeditation involved in his crimes. Judge Robert Harrison formally sentenced Kruger to death, along with multiple life sentences, to ensure he would never be released if the death penalty was overturned. Sarah Mitchell received a sentence of 30 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to kidnapping and conspiracy charges. Robert Hayes was sentenced to 25 years, while James Morrison and Linda Curtis each received 15-year sentences in exchange for their cooperation with investigators and their lesser roles in the criminal organization. The convictions brought a measure of closure to the families of victims who had been missing for years without explanation. Miguel Martinez, who had spent nearly a decade searching for his daughters, finally had definitive answers about their fate and the knowledge that their killers would face justice. However, the emotional toll of the trial and the graphic details revealed during testimony proved almost as traumatic as the original disappearance. Elizabeth Martinez struggled with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder throughout the legal proceedings. The extensive media coverage of the trial forced her to relive her ordeal repeatedly, making her recovery process even more difficult. She eventually relocated to another state and changed her name, seeking privacy and the opportunity to rebuild her life away from the constant reminders of her captivity. The Kruger case prompted significant changes in how law enforcement agencies coordinate searches for missing persons in wilderness areas. The Arkansas State Police established specialized units trained in detecting signs of long-term human habitation in remote forest areas, and federal agencies improved information sharing protocols to identify patterns in disappearances across state lines. Daniel Kruger was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit in Arkansas on September 15, 2015, exactly 14 years after Elizabeth and Bella Martinez had first entered the Ouachita wilderness. His final words were a rambling statement about the corruption of modern society and his belief that he had been performing a necessary service by removing weak individuals from the population. He showed no remorse for his victims or their families. Elizabeth Martinez, who had changed her name and relocated to Oregon, chose not to witness the execution. Through her attorney, she released a statement saying that while Kruger's death provided closure, it could never restore the years stolen from her or bring back her sister Bella. She had spent the previous 6 years undergoing intensive therapy and had gradually rebuilt her life, earning a degree in social work and dedicating herself to helping other trauma survivors. The case prompted significant changes in how missing person investigations are conducted in wilderness areas across the United States. The Department of Justice established new protocols for coordinating multi-state searches when disappearances show similar patterns, and federal funding was allocated for specialized training programs that teach law enforcement officers to recognize signs of long-term human habitation in remote forest areas. The Ouachita National Forest itself was permanently changed by the discoveries made during the investigation. The Forest Service installed improved communication equipment and increased ranger patrols in previously unmonitored areas. Warning signs were posted at trailheads, advising hikers to travel in groups and maintain regular contact with family members or park authorities. Miguel Martinez never fully recovered from the loss of his daughters and the trauma of the 8-year search. He passed away in 2018 from complications related to heart disease, with doctors noting that the prolonged stress of his daughter's disappearance had significantly contributed to his declining health. Carmen Martinez continued operating the foundation they had established, which had provided assistance to over 200 families dealing with missing person cases. Forensic anthropologists working the burial sites eventually recovered remains from 18 victims, ranging in age from 16 to 54. DNA analysis identified 12 of the victims, finally providing answers to families who had been searching for missing loved ones for years. The remaining unidentified remains were buried in a memorial garden established near Little Rock, with a granite monument honoring all victims of wilderness crimes. The surviving members of Kruger's group were gradually released from federal prison between 2020 and 2025 after serving their reduced sentences. All were required to undergo psychological evaluation and participate in monitoring programs designed to ensure they posed no continued threat to public safety. None expressed remorse for their actions, and several required protective custody due to threats from families of victims. In 2019, Elizabeth Martinez published a memoir titled 8 Years Gone, A Survivor's Journey from Captivity to Freedom, which became a bestseller and raised awareness about the psychological impact of prolonged captivity. She donated all proceeds to organizations supporting missing person investigations and trauma recovery programs. The book sparked renewed interest in the case and prompted several documentary productions. The Martinez case remains one of the most extensively studied examples of organized criminal activity in America's wilderness areas. Criminology students continue to analyze the case as an example of how predators can exploit the vastness and isolation of public lands to operate undetected for extended periods. The investigation techniques developed during the manhunt for Kruger have been adopted by law enforcement agencies worldwide. Today, the Caney Creek Wilderness Area, where Elizabeth and Bella Martinez first disappeared, serves as a memorial to all victims of wilderness crimes. A small plaque marks the location where their research campsite was discovered, reminding visitors that even in America's most beautiful natural areas, vigilance and preparation remain essential for safety. The legacy of the Martinez sisters lives on through the countless lives saved by improved search protocols, better emergency communication systems, and increased awareness of the dangers that can lurk in even the most serene wilderness settings. Their story serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity.